Hello. In this last of the lectures for Chapter 2, related to social psychology research, we'll be covering challenges that are specific to social psych research. You'll read about this in your book. Pay attention to this lecture because we'll be talking about this in class with a lot more examples next week. So the roots of social psychology emerged a lot after World War II, when we had this phenomenon with so many people watching callously as their neighbors and storekeepers were hustled away because they were Jewish. And you think about, was a really interesting phenomenon, not just those who did this torturing and engaged in this cruel action, but also those who observed it. Like, how did this come to be? What are we? Where do we come from? And a lot of the major social psychology research stemmed from that. We could think about Milgram's work. Do people obey authority figures even if the command is a violation of morals? Who does it? How? Why? What are the conditions in which people will obey in order to kill someone? And do we still face this today? We'll talk about this more coming up in the chapter. Do people watch blindly as another individual is tortured? We have the Kitty Lutzinger study in which people watched a young woman getting murdered and nobody took any action, the bystander effect. We'll talk about that more. We have people going along with a group, conforming with their peers, even if the group is wrong. How could that be? What makes us behave in this way? So a lot of the studies that we have in social psych emerged from this time. We can think about this, though, that we want to study these phenomena that are pretty challenging to observe. I mean, we can't create a situation in which we hesitate to create a situation in which people are commanded to hurt another person, and yet we want to learn more about it and study it. So that's why we have particular problems in social psychology and studying research. So remember, we're trying in social psychology to understand cognition and behavior as they naturally occur in a social context. But what is the characteristic of a social concept except that it's unique and it's dynamic? And so we have some challenge. One problem that's a really key problem is just the Hawthorne effect. If we're simply trying to observe people, the very act of observing them might change their behavior. We know how we are when we're being watched. A second key problem is external validity. Let's say then we decide to avoid the Hawthorne effect and create a lab situation where people maybe are being watched through a two-way mirror and don't even know they're being observed. But if we do that, we've taken out all the richness of the legitimate social context. Do we have anything we can generalize to the public? So you can see the challenges of just a couple of them. So, again, the Hawthorne effect leads to problems with internal validity. So if we're trying to observe a phenomenon and we decide to use a laboratory situation, then we might have a badly designed internal study. Then we have to be really careful there. How are we manipulating it? How high quality is the manipulation to which we're exposing the individuals? How well does the setting represent the broader social context, or do we take away that dynamic too much? What are good measures of the behavior of interest? Does our measure actually measure that behavior? Do we have any confounds that are really getting in the way? So internal validity, or the integrity of the design of the study itself, might be a problem. Can we check the manipulations, the social context, and other factors? We will find that in social psychology, when we're trying to expose people to a stimulus, we do have manipulation checks to make sure the stimulus is accurate. I'll give you a quick example of this just because I have it here. Let's say we're interested in people's response, in individuals' response to online profiles that have an attractive image versus an unattractive image. Well, how do we know that the image we're presenting is really attractive to most people? Well, generally how that would be done is we'd present people with, say, 1,000 different images. We'd randomly select people and expose them to these images and ask them to do quick assessments of the attractiveness. So rate from 1 to 10, rate from 1 to 10, rate from 1 to 10. And we'd aggregate all of those findings, and then from those who were rated attractive by the most people, we would choose the attractive faces. That would be a manipulation check that we would use. External validity, the ability to generalize, would lead us to want to make sure and approximate the situation as best we can. So we can't do it in a social situation, potentially, because there would be too many confounds, but we can maybe approximate it as closely as we can. And finally, subject rights. If we go on to tell people we're measuring a behavior, let's say we tell them we're measuring aggression, they might alter their aggression. So then we come into a challenge with informed consent because we're supposed to tell people what we're looking at. So these are some examples. Do we have to lie? How are we going to handle this problem? So an example study that we'll use answers the question of whether unconscious stimuli affect behaviors like kindness and generosity. So what we're really looking here when we say unconscious stimuli are what we call primes, and they're little tidbits of information. You might think of it, if you've heard of subliminal advertising, that's not exactly a documented phenomenon in social psychology, but primes are. You're exposing someone to an unconscious stimuli that you expect to impact their behavior. And so this is what we're interested in. So how do we activate an unconscious behavior? William Bard is one of the key researchers in this area, and we would activate this unconscious behavior by giving the brain something else to do. So in the research that we're going to look at, we would see that we give people a task to do, that is unscrambling sentences, but we're going to vary the words that we give them to unscramble. And the actual words that they're unscrambling, their mind is busy unscrambling the sentences, but the words that they're exposed to are hypothesized to influence a behavior. Another challenge in a study like this might be, how do we measure kindness and generosity? Should we just ask them how kind and generous they feel? I mean, sure, that's one way, but what if we could create a situation that would lead them where they would have an option to either act kindly or unkindly? And so that is what is nice to do in social psychology. Maybe the situation would be they walk outside of the lab, they're exposed to the unconscious stimuli, they walk outside the laboratory, and there is someone who just drops a big pile of books. Do they stop to help that person or not? Or they walk outside the laboratory, and there is someone who says, would you please help me by completing my survey, I need it for class. Do they say yes or do they say no? Or we could create even another situation in which they're playing a game, and at the end of the game, if they win the game, they get to do something to the loser, like blast them with a loud sound, or give them a drink with a lot of hot pepper in it, and they can make the sound really loud and really long, or they can make the beverage really spicy, or they can make it less spicy. So what are they going to do? Are they going to behave kindly and give them a soft, quiet blast, or are they going to behave aggressively and give them the worst possible? So these can be some real ways to measure it. The challenge, how do we know other factors happen to influence the behavior? Maybe the person is just in a bad mood. Or maybe there's another stimulus in the environment, a pounding hammer outside, or, maybe right when that person came in, there was a car accident outside. So what we try to do then is to create a lab situation where we kind of replicate the outside world, but we remove those extraneous factors. And because I mentioned mood in this prompt, I'll just say that the laws of statistics should make the mood possibility even across the groups, which means we can still compare them. Because we've randomly assigned people to a condition, we would assume that if someone in group A is in a bad mood, there's someone in group B in a bad mood as well, and that those things should even out across the groups. So second solution, we're going to do our best to find a natural situation that has few distractions. So the hall outside of a little used classroom you'll see in quite a few social psych experiments. Or we can engage participants in sort of a street show in which they're so engaged with us that they aren't paying attention to what's happening outside of them. The challenge, here's this one, how do we know, thought I had it in here, how do we know subjects didn't behave in a certain way just because they're in a good or bad mood? And there, we measure their mood before and after, we can take it into account, and then the laws of statistics should round it out anyhow. So even if one individual is in a bad mood, it shouldn't make a difference to the group data. The challenge, how do we adhere to the human rights guidelines, like informed consent, if we're lying to subjects about what we're measuring? How do we measure properly if we tell them? So if we tell people we're interested in aggressive behavior or in kindness, right away they're going to change their behavior. So we do have to lie, and we'll talk about how we deal with this on an upcoming slide. So this is the study I thought we were coming to. This is the study by Williams and Barg. Barg is one of the key researchers in priming relationships. And this is, do unconscious stimuli affect speed and effectiveness? And so this is the scrambled sentence task I just mentioned to do. Individuals are asked to sort. So individuals were called into a lab and randomly assigned. They were all going to sort words into plausible four-word sentences. 5-word cards into plausible four-word sentences as part of what they claimed this word ostensibly as part of a language task. That's what they were told they were doing.